From Natufians to Proto-Semites. What ancient Middle Eastern population could best represent the ancestors of the Israelites? In order to answer this question, we must understand who the Israelites are ethnically. According to language, archaeology, and anthropology, the Israelites are an Afro-Asiatic Semitic population. Their own genealogy even backs this up. The Israelites were a confederation of Iron Age Semitic-speaking tribes of the ancient Near East. Hebrew people are mostly taken as synonymous with the Semitic-speaking Israelites. Afrasan, a large family of related languages spoken both in Asia and Africa. Semitic, a major branch of the Afro-Asiatic language family. So this is how we know the Israelites are an Afro-Asiatic or Afrasan Semitic people. The lineage of Israel is traced through the father's line from Shem to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Therefore, Y-DNA chromosomes is the best form of science to use. According to Genesis chapter 11, verse 10 through 26, it reads, "This is the genealogy of Shem. Shem was 100 years old and begot Arphaxad 2 years after the flood. After he begot Arphaxad, Shem lived 500 years and begot sons and daughters." And then from verse 10 to 26 it reads, "Shem, Arphaxad, Shelah, Eber, Peleg, Ru, Serg, Nahor. Now Terah lived 70 years and begot Abram," and he is our main focus. Therefore, the ultimate goal is to figure out what ancient Middle Eastern population can best represent the ancestors of Afro-Asiatic Semites from the paternal lineage. This can lead us to the Israelites. From all of that I've gathered so far in my research, and from the many videos that we've covered, all evidence points to the Natufian population as being the ancestors of Semites, whether the earth is old or young. But for now, I'll try to speak from more of an old earth perspective. Let's begin. Many anthropologists have come to the conclusions of the Natufians as the ancestors of Proto-Semites. Natufians genetically are Neolithic Levantines. Natufians' Y-DNA chromosome is haplogroup E, and the homeland of Natufians is basically in the future Promised Land. In Hot Pursuit of Language and Prehistory, it reads, "This paper makes an additional inference, since there is archaeological and physical anthropological reason to believe that the Natufians were related to modern Semitic-speaking peoples of the Levant." So the Natufians are the ancestors of Semites. The Y-DNA chromosome of the Natufians is haplogroup E. This is from Paleolithic DNA from the Caucasus, reveals core of West Eurasian ancestry, and it reads, "Such a scenario would also explain the presence of Y chromosome haplogroup E in the Natufians and Levantine farmers, a common link between the Levant and Africa." And when you look at the area of Natufian culture and the Promised Land, I do think it's quite interesting how there seems to be a perfect overlap. Again, like I said, I believe that the Natufians are the ancestors of Semites, according to what many archaeologists have said, and with the homeland of given to Abraham matching that of the Natufian area, it almost makes it feel like and seem like that this area basically always belonged to Shem, that this land is a birthright in a sense. One thing I would like to add is that it's extremely interesting how the Natufian homeland matches perfectly with the Promised Land. Perhaps this makes sense with the Levant being the territory of Shem. The Natufians would basically represent ancestral Semitic populations, which would technically make the Levant the ancestral homeland of Semites, and therefore make Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob the rightful heirs of the Promised Land. And again, just to show you another map, and you can just type in the Promised Land map and just type in Natufian area of Natufian culture, and it hauntingly overlaps one another. Again, Natufians would represent the ancestral Semitic population, and with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob being Semites, then basically the Levant or the Promised Land is an ancient ancestral land to Semitic populations, including the Israelites, a birthright, as I said. So, the ancestors of early Semitic populations, like the Akkadians, descend from PPNB, or Neolithic Levantine populations. This is early pastoral nomadicism and the settlements of lower Mesopotamia, and it's going to get exactly into what I just said. Akkadians and early Semitic populations descending from PPNB populations. So it reads, the Akkadians' nomadic origins have generally been assumed. However, the conventional prehistoric archaeological picture fails to illustrate those origins and the Akkadians' involvement in Akkad. Thus, the origins of pastoral nomadicism must be sought in the context of mixed farming with the Fertile Crescent, specifically during the PPNB. Subsequent expansion into marginal agricultural lands led to a symbiotic relationship between pastoral nomads and farmers. The Akkadians seem to have moved into the northern Arabian steppe and desert during the mid-7th century BC. The PPNB/C populations apparently began intrusive herding at the end of that period, intensive herding at the end of that period, and maintained ties to the Fertile Crescent seen in both exotic trade and everyday culture. They began to penetrate into Akkad during the time under discussion. Archaeological sequences in the Arabian desert suggest that the Akkadians probably were of a West Semitic Levantine background. So when it comes to the Akkadians and early Semitic populations, what we're going to see is that pastoral nomadicism is a very important cultural element of Semites. And we see that the Akkadians would have a Levantine background. They'll be coming from the Levant, and that these early Semitic populations, like the Akkadians, basically descend from Pre-Pottery Neolithic B and Pre-Pottery Neolithic C populations. So let's actually dig deeper into this. Who are PPNB/PPNC Levantine populations? Pre-Pottery Neolithic B, PPNB, is part of the Pre-Pottery Neolithic, a Neolithic culture centered in Upper Mesopotamia and the Levant. Like the earlier PPNA people, Pre-Pottery Neolithic A people, the PPNB culture developed from the Mesolithic Natufian culture. So as we see that Pre-Pottery Neolithic cultures are linked to the Natufians. The Natufian culture is a late Epipaleolithic archaeological culture of the Levant dating to around 15,000 to 11,500 years ago. The culture was unusual in that it supported a sedentary and semi-sedentary population, which before the introduction of agriculture. The Neolithic communities may be the ancestors of the builders of the first Neolithic settlements of the region, which may have been the earliest in the world. So Natufians are early agriculturalists and early builders. So this is from the genetic linguistic inference paper, and it's going to detail the connection between Natufians and pre-pottery culture. So it reads, the 2005 book, First Farmers, The Origins of Agricultural Societies by Peter Bellwood provides an excellent resource for linguists who wish to explore the worldwide correlation between the origins of agriculture and the expansion of languages. Prior to the adoption of agriculture in Southwest Asia and elsewhere in the world, for that matter, the human tribe practiced hunter-gatherer techniques in order to survive. The evolution of agriculture in Southwest Asia generally follows a series of cultural transitions that begin with the Natufians, followed by the Pre-Pottery Neolithic A and Pre-Pottery Neolithic B, and then finally the development of pottery itself. The Natufians stand as an important cultural transition because they were the last hunter-gatherers in the Middle East. The Natufians appear near the Sea of Galilee in what is now present-day Israel. So we see that Natufians are basically linked to pre-pottery Neolithic A and B populations, and that these Natufians are the last hunter-gatherers, and they become early agriculturalists and pastoralists. So here's the area of Natufian culture. Basically, it's from Sinai and the Negev all the way up into modern-day Syria, and the distribution of Pre-Pottery Neolithic B sites. It's basically the same as the Natufian culture when it comes to where they were situated, from the Sinai and the Negev all the way up into modern-day Syria. And the reason that it's a perfect overlap is because basically Natufian populations and PPNB populations are somewhat one and the same. So PPNB and PPNC Neolithic populations were dominated by haplogroup E. I think that's important to understand. Work at the site of En Ghazel in Jordan has indicated a later pre-pottery Neolithic C period which existed between 8,200 and 7,900 BP. Juris Zarins has proposed that a Circum-Arabian Nomadic Pastoral Complex developed in the period from the climatic crisis of 6,200 BC, partly as a result of an increasing emphasis in PPNB cultures upon animal domesticates and a fusion with Harifian hunter-gatherers in southern Palestine with affiliated connections with the cultures of Phylum and the eastern desert of Egypt. Cultures practicing this lifestyle spread down the Red Sea shoreline and moved east from Syria into southern Iraq. And so this culmination of PPNC, PPNB, and the Harifian peoples would have basically formed Proto-Semitic, specifically Proto-Semites descending from the Harifians, who are the last stage of Natufians. And the spread of this lifestyle actually does fit with the spread of Proto-Semitic people going down the Red Sea shoreline and moving east into Syria and southern Iraq. That fits perfectly with the spread of Proto-Semites. But first, let's keep our focus on these PPNB and see what their DNA is. En Ghazel is a Neolithic archaeological site located in the metropolitan Amman, Jordan. The settlement at En Ghazel, the spring of the Gazelle, first appeared in the middle PPNB or Pre-Pottery Neolithic B time period. Y-DNA haplogroup E1B1B1B2 has been found at 75% of the En Ghazel population. That's very interesting because, again, En Ghazel is a Pre-Pottery Neolithic B population, so they had 75% of haplogroup E, along with 60% of PPNB populations, just in general, having haplogroup E, and is present in all three stages of PPNB and in most Natufians. So when it comes to Pre-Pottery Neolithic B populations, they're overwhelmingly haplogroup E. And this makes sense because the Neolithic Levant was basically dominated by haplogroup E. This is from ancient DNA from Chalcolithic Israel, reveals the role of population mixture in cultural transformation. And it reads, this finding contrasts with both earlier Neolithic and Epipaleolithic Levantine populations, which were dominated by haplogroup E. So Levantine populations in the Neolithic, like the Pre-Pottery Neolithic and the PPNC, PPNB, and PPNA, they were dominated by haplogroup E. And of course, this is all important because the ancestors of Semites are PPNB populations. So here's a good map just showing you where we find all these E samples in the Neolithic Levant. It was full of E from, as we can see, En Ghazel, PPNB, and Natufians, and even in the Chalcolithic, and even in the Chalcolithic of Anatolia. Here's just a good map showing you the area of haplogroup E in the Levant, as well as the area of Natufian culture. Overlaps beautifully. So the last stage of Natufian culture is the Harifian culture. And from the Harifian culture will come Proto-Semites. This is how everything culminates together. Harifian is a specialized regional cultural development of the Epipaleolithic of the Negev Desert. It corresponds to the latest stages of the Natufian culture. More recently, Juris Zarins has suggested that the development of the Circum-Arabian Nomadic Pastoral Complex of cultures developed in the period of the 6200 BCE climatic crisis, stretching from southern Palestine down the Red Sea shoreline and northeastward into Syria and Iraq, spread Proto-Semitic languages through the region. And so that's how everything culminates. It is this Circum-Arabian Nomadic Pastoral Complex, and it's spread. And again, it stretched from the southern Palestine down the Red Sea shoreline and into Syria and Iraq. And this is the spread of Proto-Semitic languages. Basically, it's the Harifian culture. By the way, that is the sources right here. Early pastoral nomadicism in the settlement of Lower Mesopotamia. And continuing, it says, this complex may have developed from the fusion of Harifian and PPNB or Pre-Pottery Neolithic B cultures in the southern Palestine. So, again, when we put all this together, we see that when it comes to these Proto-Semites, that, likely them being E markers, because PPNB populations basically carried nothing but haplogroup E. They had a very large amount of haplogroup E among them. And with the Harifians being the latest stage of the Natufian culture, we already know that Natufians carried haplogroup E as well. This is why I posit Proto-Semitic populations having haplogroup E, with them basically being descendants of Natufians being a part of the Harifians and the PPNB cultures of Palestine, and then spreading down the Red Sea shoreline and into Syria and Iraq. Harifian has close connections with their late Mesolithic cultures of Phylum and the eastern desert of Egypt, whose tool assemblages resembles that of the Harifian. Fusion with animal domestication elements of the Pre-Pottery Neolithic B culture is hypothesized by Juris Zarins to have led to the Circum-Arabian Nomadic Pastoral Complex, a group of cultures that invented nomadic pastoralism, and may have been the original culture which spread Proto-Semitic languages throughout the region. And as I said earlier, and I'll get into this later on in this video, but nomadic pastoralism is a very important cultural element of Semites, especially when you read the Torah, which I'll cover here soon. But basically, like I said, this Harifian and PPNB sort of is the ancestral population from who Proto-Semites would come from. And again, this is why haplogroup E is the best bet for Proto-Semites, because Harifians and PPNB would have had haplogroup E. So here is the Harifian culture, as they said. It is near Sinai in the Negev. And here's the late Natufian and early PPNA. And so this is also, when you looked at my other map, you saw a lot of E markers basically concentrated where all these ancient cities would be, these Neolithic cities, early Neolithic sites, should I say. And this is, again, why I would say early Semitic populations. They would have haplogroup E because they're descending from these ancestral populations to Semites, Harifians, and PPNB populations, because they had haplogroup E. So what's interesting about these ancestral Semitic populations like the Harifians, Natufians, PPNA, PPNC, and PPNB is the strong cultural importance and association with pastoralism and agriculture, which, these populations seem to have been the first to do. So this is the actual paper that we're going to read that will basically solidify the idea of these early PPNB populations being ancestors of Semites, their geographical homeland, and early pastoral nomadicism. So this book is called Early Pastoral Nomadicism and the Settlement of Lower Mesopotamia by Juris Zarins. And it reads, the Pre-Pottery Neolithic B complex and the Fertile Crescent. The PPNB cultural manifestations appear to solidify and expand on the earlier tenuous steps towards mixed agriculture and perhaps were begun in the late Epipaleolithic and PPNA, since its definition at Jericho by Kenyon. The sedentary aspect of the PPNB has been found in a large R covering Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Israel, Syria, and Turkey. So that's basically the area of PPNB. So recognizing the pattern, most archaeologists refer to a Levantine origin for this phenomenon, basically the pre-pottery Neolithic culture. More suggests a concept called the ancient Levant, which included subsequently all of Syria, western Iraq, most of Jordan, and a portion of the northern Saudi Arabia. The researchers at Pelimra refer to PPNB sites there as part of the inland Levant. So basically, the ancient Levant, which is Syria, western Iraq, Jordan, and northern Saudi Arabia, all of that would be your PPNB sites. That is the area of pre-pottery Neolithic complex. So here is a map that details that. Again, figure 2, Fertile Crescent in relationship to the ancient Levant. All of this will be the PPNB sites in the area of PPNB culture. So this is what we're dealing with. And again, it's basically the Natufian area of culture because it's the same geographical region. This is also where I believe, the ancestral homeland of Semites is all of this, Shem. So here's a closer image, just in case you couldn't see that. So after 4 seasons of excavation at En Ghazel in Jordan, the investigators have subdivided the sequence into 3 specific phases: PPNB, which is 7,000 through 6,200 BC, PPNC, which is 6,200 through 5,800 BC, also called final PPN or PPNB final, the PN pre-Neolithic 5,800 through 5,000 BC, sometimes called late Neolithic. 3 major topics: climate, substance, and lithic technology, which related to pastoral nomadicism and can be recognized in the archaeological record, are briefly examined here in light of the revised PPNB/C record. It seems clear that the PPNB/C was part of a climatic optimum that declined slowly and terminated its stages during the late 3rd millennium BC. Allart speaks of a wetter phase during the early part of that period, which allowed the spread of PPNB culture into other marginal sites such as Bakros and Quoum. Moore has postulated a major shift in vegetation zones between the beginning of the Natufian and the end of the PPNB. Others have suggested that the climate of southern Palestine was much wetter during the 7th millennium BC. And if it's more wetter, likely a better place for more agriculture and even some pastoralism for the animals that drink water. Economically, according to Bar Yosef, a radical change took place by the end of the period. Without clearly stating that the PPNB animals were domesticated, he suggested that a drastic faunal change was evident at such sites as Meret Bet, Abu Hariya, Bas-Semon, Jericho, and Abu Ghosh. And the evidence of sheep remains at Jericho, found outside their natural habitat, also suggests a concerted, conscious manipulation. So basically somebody, people would have brought these sheep to places like Jericho because they found outside the natural habitat of where sheep normally are. So it's very interesting to see early forms of pastoralism in the Levant. And now let's finish what it's saying. So a study of the fauna at Jericho convinced Colton Brock that domesticated sheep and goats were present by the 8th millennium BC. More suggests that ovipaprids, and by the way, that's just domesticated sheep and goats. I'll show you the definition here in a second. But going back, more suggests that ovipaprids and gazelle were herded by the PPNB. More later proposed that only ovipaprids were herded and that the innovation began during the PPNB. So again, PPNB is when we're seeing a lot of this early forms of pastoralism, this formation of basically of what Semites would be known for as a pastoral people. And again, as I promised, I was going to show y'all what ovicaprid means. And basically, it's a domesticated sheep and goats. Ovicaprid. If you ever hear that term, or if you ever hear me say it again, basically it just means domesticated sheep and goats. So the earlier levels of Tel Aswad contained a majority of wild animals, but by the PPNC, domesticated ovicaprids were dominated. At Barquas, contemporary to the last half of the PPNB at Abu Huraira, and thus part of the PPNC, the initial faunal identification suggests that ovicaprids remains predominated and that goats were semi-domesticated. At N-Gazelle during the PPNB, herding domesticated goats and hunting were equally important. In PPNC, goats were increasingly well represented and hunting declined. So as we can see, these PPNB populations all throughout the Levant began to practice domesticated pastoralism, specifically domesticating sheep and goats. And we also began to see a decline in hunting. And this is all culminating together to eventually become the Semitic population, because these are ancestral Semites. But again, these are all PPNB populations within the Levant, and they are domesticating sheep and goats, and they're beginning to hunt less. So this is all very important. The distribution of animal domesticates in the Levant, coupled with other evidence, suggests that the hearth area of much of PPNB animal husbandry may have been in the northern Syria region just north of Jezreel. The spread of the PPNC culture over the desert/steppe suggests the continuation of a mixed subsistence strategy, but one that also included some limited sheep/goat herding. So again, these Levantine populations, these PPNB, or these Neolithic Levantine populations, are some of the earliest peoples beginning to domesticate sheep and goats. You begin to see sheep and goat herding. So in summary, by 6200 BC, a recognizable PPNC culture had begun to penetrate the more marginal environments of the Near East, both south into the Negev and Sinai, and east of the Levant into Jordan and Saudi Arabia. In each succeeding period, the growing reliance on domesticated herds at the expense of farming and hunting and gathering can be documented, thus demonstrating the gradual but inexorable shift to specialized pastoralism. So again, we see that these PPNB and PPNC populations began to expand more, and they began to become truly a nomadic people, and they had domesticated herds of sheep and goats, and all of this began in the Levant and began to spread from the Levant into other regions. So the PPNB, Pre-Pottery Neolithic B, and Pastoral Neolithic steppe/desert cultures of Syria and Iraq. So it reads, the above discussion can provide a basis for examining similar materials from the Jezreel steppe of Iraq, Syria, and Turkey, and the deserts of southeast Syria and western Iraq. Subsequent patterns carefully defined a mixed farming / hunter-gathering strategy, and the lithics are in the larger Levantine PPNB / C tradition. Several sites in Jezreel were located on the frontiers of rainfall farming. The influence from the Levantine tradition may extend even to Hassunia. Calson again found an abundance of domesticated sheep, goats, and cattle, and continued that plant cultivation was of little importance. So this right here is also interesting. So now we see an introduction of cattle, but plant cultivating is very minuscule. But still, we now see an introduction of cattle, domesticated cattle. So let's finish what it says. So examinations of those sites of Jezreel suggest that the steppe environment was marginal for farming, but excluded for expanding herds. So it's an area for marginal farming, but not for herding. So to summarize, PPNB populations began to expand into the areas of the Near East often considered marginal to the Fertile Crescent. That expansion has been well documented in the Negev and Sinai, eastern Jordan, and the Qom in Syria. Again, we're basically dealing with the Levant, where surveys and limited excavations have established some chronological reasonability, artifact context, and relevant faunal and flora particulars. A number of points suggest a close interaction between those steppe and desert sites and the Levantine region itself. So, origins of pastoralism. So now let's get a little bit deeper into pastoralism. Anthropologists have long debated the definition of pastoral nomadicism. Several recent syntheses have suggested that all pastoral nomads share certain characteristics such as strong localized kinship and lineage bonds, impermanent dwellings, movement to procure pasturage and water for herds, and specific relationships to formal states. Thus, pastoral nomadicism seems to stress animal husbandry along patterned migration routes, exploiting marginal environments. Developmental models studying pastoral nomadicism have largely focused on the historical record, largely because researchers have concluded that a close symbiotic relationship exists between the urban settled peoples and the nomadic peoples. Now, all of this dealing with the origins of pastoralism is very interesting because the characteristics such as a strong localized kinship and lineage bonds and impermanent dwellings, as well as having land and a waterway for the herds of the animals that you have, all of this is very reminiscent of what Abraham and his family had when they were in the land of Canaan and when they were traveling to Canaan, this animal husbandry and such. You see a lot of these parallels with early pastoral nomadicism and Semitic culture and Semitic people like Abraham. Because what did Abraham have? He had a localized kinship and he had lineage bonds that we will read about in the Old Testament. And all of this matches perfectly with what we see in the scriptures. So let's go further with this. The evidence, however, points towards a new interpretation. Pastoral nomadicism began by the end of the 7th millennium BC as populations began to mobilize the discovery of animal husbandry in a new and dramatic way. The process can be seen as a third-tier step. First, based on faunal material, found in the Fertile Crescent, we can conclude that domesticated ovipaриds and cattle were present as early as the mid-7th millennium BC. Second, within the steppe region, as exemplified by the Juris and Qom, herding was emphasized. That suggestion is based on the location of sites in a very low rainfall area, and the apparent domination of animals over plants in the economy. Third, if domesticated animals were known to the inhabitants of the Fertile Crescent and the steppe and the desert sites are chronologically contemporaneous or interrelated, the latter may represent early pastoral nomads who still exercised a broad spectrum approach for substance. The picture of faunal reversal beginning at the PPNC supports these conclusions, as the faunal curves at Abu Harera and elsewhere suggests a reliance on wild gazelle was almost totally replaced by one on domesticated ovipaриds. Two other arguments can buttress these suggestions here. First, the substantial increase in site numbers and site sizes in the late PPNB in the desert and steppe seems strongly related to complex interactions between the nomads and the settled populations. Animal domestication may be one variable responsible for that increase. Indeed, the Angazelle, Jericho, Kilwa, Nahal, and Hamir link would argue for close interaction of the type suggested from the ethnographic record. Second, the appearance of numerous sites in western Iraq along watercourses that today are dry indicates both climatic amelioration during the PPNB and the ability of a new way of life to sustain human existence in the region. It appears that late Upper and Epipaleolithic populations in western Iraq and southern Syria largely abandoned the steppe and desert. Therefore, the PPNB/C sites represent the initial resettlement that pastoral nomadicism made possible. The Levant seems to have been the cradle of early pastoralism and agriculture. These early people practicing pastoralism were Natufians, PPNA, PPNB, and PPNC populations. So, the Pre-Pottery Neolithic B complex and the Fertile Crescent. Let's reread where this is taking place. The Pre-Pottery Neolithic B complex and the Fertile Crescent. The PPNB cultural manifestations appear to solidify and expand on the earlier tenuous steps towards mixed agriculture that perhaps were begun in the late Epipaleolithic and PPNA. Since its definition at Jericho by Kenyon, the sanitary aspect of the PPNB has been found in a large or covering Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Israel, Syria, and Turkey. So again, that's the general area of the Levant. Recognizing the pattern, most archaeologists refer to a Levantine origin for this phenomenon, and it's literally called that again. More suggests a concept called the ancient Levant, which included substantially all of Syria, western Iraq, most of Jordan, and a portion of northern Saudi Arabia. The researchers at Palmyra refer to PPNB sites there as part of the inland Levant. So all of this early PPNB, PPNA sites are all basically located in the Levant. This is where the birthplace of pastoral nomadicism is going to take place. I just want to reiterate that. And here is the zone, the Fertile Crescent in relationship to the ancient Levant. And here's the zone of all of these PPNB, PPNA, basically pre-Pottery Neolithic sites, which of course are connected to Natufians. This is the exact same homeland of the Natufians. So this is the Levant. The reason why this is important to understand is because Proto-Semites were also pastoralists. But this makes sense because early Semitic populations descend from Levantine PPNB and Natufian populations. This, still from our reading, early pastoral nomadicism and the settlement of Lower Mesopotamia, prehistoric Akkad, the sudden appearance of populations without any previous occupational history in the desert and steppe raises the question of ethnic and linguistic identity. The Semitic populations identified as Akkadians were pastoral groups who migrated from the western desert or Hemda sometime within a proto-historic Mesopotamian context. No available historical data clarify their condition in the late 4th and early 3rd millennium BC, although some possible contemporary sites have been identified in the desert. And so this is very interesting right here. So what we see is that these early Semitic populations, like the Akkadians, they are a pastoral group of people. And what we just read? We just read that early pastoral peoples were pre-Pottery Neolithic B and Natufian populations. And so Semites are going to be birthed from those Natufian descendant peoples, like the pre-Pottery Neolithic B. If we apply the historic term Akkad to define the northern Evelyn, Abu Saleh seems to lie clearly on the border. The site represents the frontier of Semitic influence to the south. In addition, the historical data from the 3rd millennium BC indicate that the kings of Kish were Semitic and ruled over the northern part of the alluvium. The distinctive ecology of Akkad favored, as it does now, a dimorphic approach to society. In that way, the pastoral populations and settled farmers and urban dwellers together created a unique settlement pattern in the northern alluvium. The prehistoric occupation pattern, like that of historical time, suggests a strong pastoral Semitic presence interacting with the settled populations. Again, Semitic people being connected to pastoral living. Semitic pastoralists appeared in the steppe desert and the alluvial fringe of Mesopotamia as early as circa 6000 BC. In suggesting periods, both prehistoric and historic, they contributed in a major way to the settlement of Akkad. Their rise to political preeminence in the north may have begun in the Proto-Literate period, as the legends of the later Sumerian SKL so admirably expressed it. The idea that Amorites, Arameans, and Arabs were essentially pastoral, nomadic Semitic people who invaded the plain has been largely accepted, perhaps based on the historical data extant for those populations. The crux of the matter in historical terms centered on the Akkadians. Again, all these early Semitic populations, from Arabians to Arameans, Akkadians, all these peoples are pastoral nomadic peoples, and therefore they will likely descend from those Natufian Levantine populations, those PPNB populations that would, form the Semitic language and culture and expand. The Semitic developments in Akkad during the early 3rd millennium BC are reflected in materials recovered in Sumer. Semitic names are attested in early dynastic documents from Afar, Abdib, Lakesh, and Nippur. And so here is a list of the legendary and attested early rulers of Kish, Mari, and Ebla. Kish, Mari, and Ebla are Semitic kingdoms. And so you see right here with Kish and then Mari and Ebla. And here's a closer image so that y'all can get a good look of the early dynastic period starting from 2900 BC all the way to 2500 BC. And all these are early Semitic names and, well, kings of Kish, Mari, and Ebla. So, our understanding of the Semitic presence in Akkad hinges on a date for those early royal and common references. Sign orthography, historical synchronisms, and textual examination help determine a date for the early Akkadian rulers of the northern alluvium. The conclusion here is that the title King of Kish, used by rulers by the early dynastic 1 through 2, referred to political supremacy over the northern part of the plain, circa 2900 through 2500 BC, a period when Semitic writing was beginning to be recognized as a state instrument for political domination. Since Semitic populations exercised that control, they exerted political and sociographic and socio-economic power not only south into Sumer, but also apparently north along the Euphrates to Mari and beyond. A cultural symbiosis was characteristic of the region, and the early Semitic populations penetrated Mesopotamia through the middle Euphrates Valley. They spread to the regions of Kish, Serasphere, and Mari and moved sporadically south. What's interesting about Natufians, PPNB, and Proto-Semites being pastoralists is that pastoralism is a very important theme that we often read about in the Bible, often, of course, with Semitic populations, descendants of Shem. This is from Christianity, Pastoralism, and Development, and it reads, the certain of early researchers of nomadic pastoralists. Much of the earliest writing and research on nomadic pastoralists was done by missionaries or men who had strong religious beliefs. Many of them were socially sensitive Christians who were fascinated by the cultures in which they found themselves, as well as motivated by evangelism zeal to go out to face the dangers and uncertainties which existed in remote areas of the world more than 100 years ago. Some of them were great scholars, scientists, and linguists, whose work is still respected by later professional anthropologists such as Desmond Hudson, who recognized their contribution even though acknowledging it comes from a missionary perspective. One of the first such pioneers was Robertson Smith, who undertook study in Arabia and became a renowned linguist and Old Testament professor in Aberdeen, and Arabic philosopher in Cambridge. In the 1880s, he wrote 3 important and controversial books, which began to give fresh insights into the social systems of the Semitic pastoral people amongst whom he was living. He also commented on the characteristics of the religious beliefs shared by many of ancient Semitic nations of the Old Testament, who were also pastoralists and frequently nomadic. He calls these the higher forms of religion. So various anthropologists and professors were studying Semitic populations and studying the interesting connection between nomadic pastoralists and Semites. And of course, this is frequently mentioned in the Old Testament. And so let's dig deeper into that. This book is from Animals and Humans Society, and it reads, pastoralism featured in the Old Testament of the Bible with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob being nomadic pastoralists. I'm going to repeat that again. Pastoralism is featured in the Old Testament of the Bible with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob being nomadic pastoralists. And this makes a lot of sense. Of course, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are Semitic people. And again, when you tie this together with what we know about in archaeology, who Semites descend from, it would be Natufians and PPNB populations, some of the earliest peoples to be pastoral nomadic peoples. And here's a great source that really details all the symbolism with pastoralism, herdsmen, and agriculture. This is from Theology of Work project titled The Pastoral Lifestyle of Abraham and His Family, and reads, anthropological studies of this period and region suggest the families in these narratives practice a mix of semi-nomadic pastoralism and herdsman husbandry. You can find this all in the chapters of Genesis. Because a family could not be entirely supported through sheep herding, it was necessary to practice local agriculture and trade with those living in more settled communities. Again, agriculture is another important element of Semites, and who were some of the first agriculturalists in the world? It would have been Natufians, and Natufians are believed to be the ancestors of Semites. Pastoral nomads cared for sheep and goats to obtain milk and meat. All of this can be found in Genesis, in the book of Genesis. Wool and other goods made from animal products such as leather. Donkeys carried loads. Again, this is found in the book of Genesis. And camels were especially suited for long range travel. Again, found in Genesis. All of this is in the early chapters, the early and late chapters of Genesis, specifically dealing with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The patriarchal narratives repeatedly mention the great wealth of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the book of Genesis. Shepherd herding and animal husbandry were honored fields of work and could be lucrative, and Abraham's family became very wealthy. Therefore, Natufians seem to be the best ancient population in the Middle East to represent the ancestors of Proto-Semitic populations, since Natufians were some of the earliest pastoral populations within the Near East. The Natufian culture in the Levant threshold to the origins of agriculture. Data have led to the recognition that a Natufian homeland existed in the central Levant, and that the Natufians were secondary foragers and perhaps the earliest farmers. Again, Natufians in the homeland of the Levant. This is where Proto-Semites would eventually come from. And they're farmers, some of the earliest farmers. This information led to the recognition that the Natufian culture played a major role in the emergence of the early Neolithic farming communities, or what is known as the agricultural revolution. These guys are the pioneers of that. So here is the area of Natufian culture. Again, it's in the Levant. Also, you have the Harifian culture right here, who would basically become the Proto-Semites. So you have the early Natufian homeland right here, late Natufian homeland, going all the way from the Negev into Syria, well, what would be modern day Syria, and also the Harifian culture in Sinai and the Negev. So these would be your early farmers, your early agriculturalists, pastoralists, and they would expand and become Proto-Semitic peoples. Here's a closer image just so you can see. So, the prehistory of the dispersal, the Proto-Afrosan or Proto-Afroasiatic farming lexicon. This is going to detail, again, a deeper understanding of the Natufians and why they are considered the ancestors of Afro-Asiatic peoples, which includes Semitic peoples. So it reads, the identification of Proto-Afrosans as Natufians and post-Natufians seems to satisfy all the four criteria. Besides the farming lexicon, there are sets of reconstructed Proto-Afrosan terms pointing to incipient animal breeding, a wide variety of dwelling and settlement types, a territory characterized by both desert and steep forest type of terrain and drying riverbeds, as well as deep permanent streams, a vegetation typical of such territory, and the animals whose bones have been found at the Natufian and early Neolithic post-Neolithic sites. Interestingly, there is a large number of common Afrosan terms denoting flocked ungulate animals usually inhabiting steppes and semi-deserts. So again, what we just read is very reminiscent of what we read earlier from the other paper talking about the animal remains that are found in these sites, in these PPNB sites, and basically in these Natufian sites, these sheep and goat remains that are not in the typical areas where they graze, but are in areas that mankind of the Natufians had moved them to due to domesticating them. So continue, it says, finally, the Levant appears to be an attested region from where populations began to spread starting in the early Neolithic, covering not only wide tracts of southwestern Asia, but also the adjacent parts of the Mediterranean and Africa. So it all begins in the Levant, where Proto-Semites would also eventually expand and begin. And by the way, Afrosan, just in case this term might be new to y'all, Afrosan and Semitic are one and the same. Semitic is a major branch of the Afro-Asiatic language family. Afrosan and Semitic are semantically related. You can use Afrosan instead a Semitic noun. And Afrosan, a large family of related languages, both spoken both in Asia and Africa. Afrosan, basically Afro-Asiatic. Semitic and Afrosan are semantically related. In some cases, you can replace the term Semitic with Afrosan. This nouns are similar. So that's, just whenever you hear that term again, because you will, just want you to know, Semitic, Afrosan, it's the same thing. And so our next reading also comes from Alexander Metolarev, who, by the way, did a very extensive study on the Natufians. Check out many of his papers and books on the Natufians because they're great. So this next reading comes from him. The Proto-Afrosan Lexicon confirming West Asian homeland pastoralism. Again, we're looking deep into pastoralism. Who are the early pastoralists? And because we know that Semites are an early pastoral population, so finding out who are the ancestors of Semites, which would be Afro-Asiatic people, and finding out who are the early pastoralists, again, an Afro-Asiatic people, this can get us closer to the location of the homeland of Semites, as well as, their genetic background. So let's dig into this next paper. The article presents one more step towards the equation of the culture of speakers of Proto-Afrosan, reconstructed on the basis of paleolinguistic data, with the early Neolithic post-Natufian culture of the Levant, according to the gradiochronological method of S.A. Sarstein. Proto-Afrosan is dated back to approximately 10,000 BC, the same period as post-Natufian, supposed to be the cradle of agriculture and livestock breeding on the planet. As far as radiocarbon dating tells us, the article offers evidence for the presence of a layer of pastoral lexicon in Proto-Afrosan in the form of 26 reconstructed names for large and small cattle and various other pastoral terms. So again, it is these Natufians who are forming these early pastoral terms for animals like sheep and goats and cattle. And we're using this method to determine who are the ancestors of Semites. And let's actually go deeper into this. So it says the objective of the present paper is to present further evidence in time referring to pastoralism, presumably practiced by the Proto-Semitic speaking community, for the identification of this community with the early Levantine villagers associated with the early Neolithic post-Natufian culture. Again, all of this has been taking place in the Levant with the Natufians, or the descendants of the Natufians. These villagers left some of the earliest known archaeological evidence for cultivation of domesticated crops, cereal, and pulse, and the raising of domesticated livestock. It is for archaeologists to evaluate the correspondences between the archaeological evidence from the Levant as well as adjacent regions and the reconstructed terminology referring to incipient archaeopastoralism in the Proto-Afrosan language, dated by the new version of the linguistic method of gladdochronology to approximately the same period and presumably the same area. This is part of a broader project aimed at drawing a most comprehensive picture featuring practically all aspects of life of early nomadic people in the Near East, which can be drawn from the reconstructed Proto-Afrosan lexicon, namely terms referring to people and society, economic life and technology, intellectual culture, and natural and physical environments. And this is from The Winds of Change, which also details basically the early Natufian culture. The Natufians were a Neolithic culture that extended from modern-day Israel to southeast Turkey and around 11,500 years ago. They were among the first people to start cultivating grains and domesticating cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs in this landscape, which varied from Mediterranean woodland to scrubland and steppe. So again, the Natufians, a Neolithic culture in the Levant, they are the first people to cultivate grain and domesticate cattle, sheep, and goats, and we know the importance of this when it comes to early Semitic culture, even found in the Torah. So the Natufians are the ancestors of early Semites. Therefore, the Y-DNA chromosome of Semites would be haplogroup E because Natufians, PPNB, and Neolithic Levantine populations carried haplogroup E. This is from In Hot Pursuit of Language and Prehistory, and it reads, "This paper makes an additional inference since there is archaeological and physical anthropological reason to believe that the Natufians were related to modern Semitic-speaking peoples of the Levant. Such a scenario would also explain the presence of Y chromosome haplogroup E in the Natufians and Levantine farmers, keyword Levantine farmers, a common link between the Levant and Africa." That's from Paleolithic DNA from the Caucasus, reveals core of West Eurasian ancestry. And this finding contrasts with both earlier Neolithic and Epipaleolithic Levantine populations, which were dominated by haplogroup E. And again, this is exactly what those other papers were saying, that these early people who were cultivating grain and who were domesticating sheep and cattle, they were Neolithic and Epipaleolithic Levantine populations. And what does this study say? This finding contrasts with both earlier Neolithic and Epipaleolithic Levantine populations, which were dominated by haplogroup E. These early PPNB, these early Neolithic populations, were dominated by E markers, and if Semites descend from these populations, then they too would have haplogroup E. By the way, this is from Ancient DNA from Chalcolithic Israel, reveals the role of population mixture in cultural transformation. And so here are all the sites, and ironically, these are the same sites where we find these people with haplogroup E, such as Angazel, PPNB. We find nothing but E markers. Also in the Natufian area, again, we know the Natufians had E. And we find it in other sites in Israel, like the Pekin Cave, as well as in Turkey. And as they said, the Natufian culture goes from Israel, modern day Israel, all the way up into Turkey. So it makes sense we'll find E markers there too. And all of this culminates, and all of this makes sense because we know that Proto-Afro-Asiatic populations carried haplogroup E, and Proto-Afro-Sans and Natufians are pretty much one and the same. The Proto-Afro-Asiatic group carrying the E-P2 mutation may have appeared at this point in time and subsequently gave rise to the different major population groups, including current speakers of the Afro-Asiatic languages and pastoralist populations. And that's what we were covering this whole time, pastoralist populations, as well as Afro-Asiatic languages. These early Afro-Asiatic people, Proto-Afro-Asiatic people, and these early pastoralist populations would have carried haplogroup E. And we know that Semitic people are part of the Afro-Asiatic family, and that early Semitic people were pastoralists. So it would make sense that they too would descend from the haplogroup E Y chromosome. And this is from Y chromosome E haplogroups, their distribution and implication to the origin of Afro-Asiatic languages and pastoralism. The ancestors of Semites are Natufians, Neolithic Levantine populations that practiced pastoralism and agriculture in the Levant. Their Y-DNA chromosome was haplogroup E. Therefore, the Levant, the promised land, would be the ancestral homeland of all Semitic populations, and in a grand sense, the rightful land of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I'm going to repeat that again. The Levant, the promised land, would be the ancestral land of all Semitic populations, and this would mean that the Levant, the promised land, is the rightful land of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, since they are, after all, a Semitic people. And so here is the area of haplogroup E clades we find, starting all the way back to the Natufians and PPNB. And here's the area of Natufian culture. And it all overlaps with the promised land given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I don't think this is a coincidence. There's something interesting going on here with the fact that early Natufians, being the ancestors of Semites, their homeland pretty much matching with the homeland given to the Israelites. It's very fascinating to me. But overall, Natufians best represent ancestral Semitic populations, therefore making the Levant the ancestral homeland of Semites. With that being said, let's move to the migration of Semites into Mesopotamia and the rest of the Middle East. According to the Bayesian phylogenetic analysis, Semites had an early Bronze Age origin in the Levant in 4000 BC and migrated into Mesopotamia. And again, Levant, homeland of Natufians. So let's actually dig deep into this paper. The Bayesian phylogenetic analysis of Semitic languages identifies an early Bronze Age origin of Semitic in the Near East. So, the evolution of languages provides a unique opportunity to study human population history. The origin of Semitic and the nature of dispersals by Semitic-speaking populations are of great importance to our understanding of the ancient history of the Middle East and Horn of Africa. Semitic populations are associated with the oldest written languages and urban civilizations in the region, which gave rise to some of the world's first major religious and literary traditions. In this study, we employ Bayesian computational phylogenetic techniques recently developed in evolutionary biology to analyze Semitic lexical data by modeling language evolution and explicitly testing alternative hypotheses of Semitic history. We implement a relaxed linguistic clock to date language divergences and use epigraphic evidence for the sampling dates of extinct Semitic languages to calibrate the rate of language evolution. Our statistical tests of alternative Semitic histories supports an initial divergence of Akkadian from ancestral Semitic over competing hypotheses, e.g., an African origin of Semitic, we estimate an early Bronze Age origin for Semitic approximately 5,750 years ago in the Levant, and further propose that contemporary Ethio-Semitic languages of Africa reflect a single introduction of early Ethio-Semitic from southern Arabia approximately 2,800 years ago. But the key thing I want y'all to keep in mind is this. We estimate an early Bronze Age origin for Semitic approximately 5,750 years ago in the Levant. So Semitic had an origin in the Levant 5,750 years ago, which is basically 3750 BC. So let's look into the introduction. Semitic languages comprise one of the most studied language families in the world. Semitic is of particular interest due to its association with the earliest civilizations in Mesopotamia, the Levant, and the Horn of Africa, which gave rise to several of the world's first major religious traditions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and literary works, such as the Akkadian poem, the Epic of Gilgamesh. The importance of Semitic dates back at least 4,350 years before present to ancient Sumer in Mesopotamia, where the Akkadian language replaced Sumerian. And that goes to show you that Sumerians aren't Akkadians, because Sumerians spoke a different language. They spoke a non-Semitic language, and the Akkadians came in and conquered the Sumerians. Check out my video on the Sumerians. So let's finish what it says. From this time forward, archaeological evidence for Semitic among the Hebrews and Phoenicians in the Levant and the Oxumites in the Horn of Africa suggests that Semitic-speaking populations and their languages underwent a complex history of geographical expansion, migrations, and diffusion tied to the emergence of the earliest urban civilizations in these regions. The field of Semitic linguists has generally coalesced around a model that places the ancient Mesopotamian language Akkadian as the most basal lineage of Semitic. And that's one thing that pretty much is established, that Akkadian seems to be one of the earliest Semitic languages. This standard model divides Semitic into East Semitic, comprised of the extinct Akkadian and Ebelite languages, and West Semitic, consisting of all remaining Semitic languages that are distributed from the Levant to the Horn of Africa. West Semitic is in turn divided into South, consisting of Ethio-Semitic, epigraphic Southern Arabian, and modern South Arabian, and Central linguistic groups. But the genealogical relationships of the languages within these two groups are poorly defined. So you have the East Semitic and the West Semitic, basically, and East Semitic is extinct. It's Akkadian and Ebelite. In this study, we analyzed lexical data from 25 Semitic languages distributed throughout the Middle East and the Horn of Africa, using the Bayesian phylogenetic method to simultaneously infer genealogical relationships and estimate divergence dates of the Semitic languages investigated here. So here's a map that details basically that dispersal of Semitic people and languages. Figure 1, map of Semitic languages and inferred dispersals. The location of all languages sampled in this study, both extinct and extant, are depicted on the map. The map also presents the dispersal of Semitic languages inferred from our study. An origin of Afroasiatic along the African coast of the Red Sea, supported by comparative analysis, right here, is indicated in red, although other African origins of Afroasiatic have been proposed, such as southwest Ethiopia. The assumed location of the divergence of ancestral Semitic from Afroasiatic between the African coasts of the Red Sea and the Near East is indicated in italics, right here, ancestral Semitic. Semitic dispersals are depicted by arrows colored according to estimate time of divergence. See color time scale at the top of the figure, which is right here. Green is the oldest, then red is basically more so in the middle, and yellow is the latest. And important nodes from the phylogeny are placed on the arrows to indicate where and when these divergences occurred. So I'm just going to show y'all right here. Green, 6,000 years ago. Basically, Semitic was in the Levant 6,000 years ago, and then it began to disperse around 4,500 BC. We see it go into Arabia, and also into Mesopotamia, and eventually it will go into the Horn of Africa. But we see basically the earliest Semitic languages spoken in the Levant. Well, it originates in the Levant, expands to Mesopotamia and Arabia. So it's basically this general geographical region going as far back as 6,000 to 4,000 BC. Very, very ancient. So now let's look a little bit deeper. So Semitic language divergence dates. Let's deal with the dates. And as you can see down below, which is in the yellow box, 6,000 BC is 4,000 BC. So this is when Proto-Semitic really starts to get its appearance. 6,000 BC, which is 4,000 BC. So let's read it. In addition to delineating the relationship between different Semitic languages, our phylogenetic analysis provides dates for the divergences of the investigated languages. The main estimates of all language divergence times with associated 95% HPDs are depicted in years on the phylogeny in Figure 2. Our phylogeny indicates the most basal divergence within Semitic occurred at 5,750 YBP. HPD 4,400 through 7,400 YBP, suggesting an origin of Semitic during the early Bronze Age. These results implies that a hypothetical ancestral language was extant during this period and gave rise to all of the Semitic languages identified in this study. And that's very interesting right there. So basically, all the Semitic languages of today likely descended from some ancient or ancestral Semitic language that is, of course, today, extinct. But they all come from some like pre-Proto-Semitic language that was in the Levant prior to 4,000 BC. That's very interesting. So let's dig deeper into the study. The deepest four branches of the phylogeny indicate the divergence of East root, and East Semitic being basically the root, West Node A, South Node E, and Central Node B Semitic. These divergences are nearly coincident with largely overlapping HPDs 3,300 through 7,400 YBP, suggesting that Semitic underwent a period of rapid diversification upon its origin. So again, I'm just going to show you this image up closely. So 6,000 BC, this is the origin of Proto-Semitic in the Levant, and it would have been in 4,000 BCE. So this is what we're dealing with in terms of time period. And the earliest or the oldest Semitic language would be the Akkadian, but there's likely a Proto-Semitic language, a pre-Proto-Semitic language that even predates Akkadian that was spoken in the Levant before it started to diversify. So, Semitic origins. Our analysis of the Semitic language family produced a dated phylogeny that estimates the origin of Semitic at approximately 4,400 through 7,400 YBP. The phylogeny suggests East Semitic, represented by Akkadian in the study, corresponds to the deepest branch. So again, Akkadian being one of the oldest. And our log FBF tests indicate that Akkadian is the approximate root of the Semitic languages analyzed here. These results indicate that the ancestor of all Semitic languages in our dataset was being spoken in the Near East no earlier than approximately 7,400 YBP after having diverged from Afro-Asiatic in Africa. And so 7,000 YBP would be basically 5,000 BC. So really that's kind of where pre-Proto-Semitic would have its origin. Pre-Proto-Semitic would be in 5,000 BC. Very, very ancient in the Levant. Our estimate for the origin of Semitic 4,400 through 7,400 YBP predates the first Akkadian inscriptions in the archaeological record of northern Mesopotamia by approximately 100 through 3,000 years. The city-states of Sumer were established and flourishing in Mesopotamia with their own indigenous languages unrelated to Semitic by approximately 5,400 YBP. And I want to make that very clear again. The Sumerians were not Semites. Sumerians spoke an unrelated Semitic language of its own indigenous language. I'm going to repeat that again. The city-states of Sumer were established and flourishing in Mesopotamia with their own indigenous languages unrelated to Semitic by approximately 5,400 YBP. So it is unlikely that Akkadian was spoken in Sumer for the entirety of the possible 3,000-year interval between the origin of Semitic and Akkadian's initial appearance in the archaeological record. And I think that's very important and key to keep in mind as well. So it is unlikely that Akkadian was spoken in Sumer. It's unlikely that Akkadian was spoken in Sumer for its entirety of the possible 3,000-year interval between the origin of Semitic and Akkadian's initial appearance in the archaeological record. And the reason for this is because the Sumerians spoke their own indigenous language that was unrelated to Semitic. So let's continue what the study says. Furthermore, Ebalites, no Ebalite word lists were available for our study, but furthermore, Ebalite, the closest relative of Akkadian and the only other member of East Semitic, was spoken in the Levant. And I think that is also very important. Key Ebalite is one of the closest Semitic languages to Akkadian, and it was spoken in the Levant. I'm going to repeat that again. Furthermore, Ebalite, the closest relative of Akkadian and the only other member of East Semitic, was spoken in the Levant, specifically the northeast Levant or present-day Syria, which also were some of the oldest West Semitic languages were spoken, such as Ugaritic, Aramaic, and Ancient Hebrew. The presence of ancient members of the two oldest Semitic groups, East and West Semitic, in the same region of the Levant. So again, we have the oldest Semitic groups, the East Semitic and the West Semitic, being spoken in the Levant. Again, this is why a Levant origin of Semites is highly plausible, and is what this paper is basically saying. Combined with the possible long interval of 100 through 3,000 years between the origin of Semitic and the appearance of Akkadian and Sumer, suggests a Semitic origin in the northeast Levant and a later movement of Akkadian eastward into Mesopotamia and Sumer. So again, as I have been saying over and over again, there is a Semitic origin within the Levant. So early Semitic dispersals. Let's get into them dispersing. Our Semitic language phylogeny indicates that the initial divergence of ancestral Semitic into East and West Semitic was nearly coincident with the divergence of West Semitic into Central and South Semitic around 5,300 YBP. The short interval between these two divergences and their overlapping HPDs suggests that both divergences may have occurred in the northeast Levant. Again, the Levant origin of these Semitic languages and the dispersal. The distribution of ancient and modern Central and South Semitic languages are consistent with Central Semitic spreading eastward throughout the Levant and South Semitic spreading southward from the Levant, eventually reaching southern Arabia. So all these Semitic languages, their origin is in the Levant and they're spreading south and east and north. The Central Semitic branch is characterized first by a divergence into Arabic and the Levantine languages such as Aramaic, Hebrew, and Ugaritic, at least 3,650 YBP, and possibly shortly after East and West Semitic diverged. The Levantine languages subsequently diverged into separate lineages by approximately 4050 YBP, but possibly as early as approximately 4400 YBP. The expansion of the Levantine languages of Central Semitic, approximately 3650 through 4400 YBP, was probably part of the migration process that was definitive of the transition from the early to the middle Bronze Age in the Levant. So again, we're dealing basically with the Levantine origin of Proto-Semitic and the spread of Semitic. Within Southern Semitic, the early emergence of a South Arabian lineage between approximately 3,300 and 6,250 YBP may reflect an early Bronze Age expansion of Semitic from the Levant southward into the Arabian Desert. Again, an early Bronze Age origin of Semitic within the Levant, and South Semitic entered southern Arabia from the Levant. The recurrent spread of early Semitic peoples and their languages into the steppe and desert lands of the Arabian Peninsula, combined with biblical testimony on early Hebrew subsistence, led us to propose that the earliest West Semitic society may have had a largely pastoralist economy, particularly adapted to such conditions. And that's very important as well because, of course, as we studied, that early Semitic populations were more so pastoral, and that early West Semitic society was pastoral as well. And this is important because Hebrew is a West Semitic language, as part of the West Semitic family. And of course, according to scriptures, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the way they lived would be that pastoral type of lifestyle. So all of this is very interesting how it's coming together. So conclusion, we used Bayesian phylogenetic methods to elucidate the relationships and divergence dates of Semitic languages, which we then related to epigraphic and archaeological records to produce a comprehensive hypothesis of Semitic origins and dispersals after the divergence of ancestral Semitic from Afroasiatic in Africa. We estimate that Semitic had an early Bronze Age origin, 5,750 YBP, in the Levant, followed by an expansion of Akkadian into Mesopotamia. So basically, to sum everything up, Proto-Semitic had an origin in the Levant in 4000 BC. That's the simplest way to put it. So in the homeland of Natufians, the Levant, we see that Proto-Semites had a Levantine origin and spread from that region. However, this makes sense. If Natufians are indeed the ancestors of Semites, then all of this makes perfect sense. Now here is a video that actually shows and details the migration of Proto-Semites from the Levant in 4000 BC, just like we just read. Copyright disclaimer. Under Title 17 U.S.C. Section 107, allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research. Fair use is permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing. Non-profit educational or personal use tips the balance in favor of fair use. So as we could see from the multiple videos that I played dealing with the spread of Proto-Semitic people and language, they all have Proto-Semitic beginning in the Levant in 4000 BC. 4000 BC is the Levantine origin of Proto-Semites. Then around 3750 BC is when we see early Semitic populations begin to migrate into Mesopotamia from the Levant, as well as migrating into Arabia from the Levant. The Levantine origin of Semites seems to be the best consensus when it comes to the origin and spread of these people. So here is 4000 BC. Semitic had an early Bronze Age origin in the Levant, and then in 3750 BC we see Semites migrate from the Levant into Mesopotamia, basically traveling through the Fertile Crescent. This fits perfectly with the ancestors of Semites being Natufians and early Semitic populations having haplogroup E. According to genetic analysis done on 6 Natufian remains from northern Israel, the Natufians carried the Y DNA haplogroup E-Z830, a somewhat upwind clade of E-Z123, and therefore ancestral to it. The Natufians were one of the first settled peoples in the world and may have contributed to the domestication of certain crops and thus the advent of agriculture, which of course is what we were covering throughout this entire video. The discovery of E-Z830 without other clades suggests an indigenous presence in Canaan and Israel that predates all other clades, which are not known to have existed in the region at the time, 10,000 years before present. Haplogroup E1B1B12 has been found in 75% of the N-Gazelle population, along with 60% of PPNB population circa 8,800 through 6,500 BC. And of course, we know that N-Gazelle and the PPNB populations are very important because PPNB populations became the early pastoralists, nomadic pastoralists, and agriculturalists. And the fact that they have 60% and 75% of haplogroup E, again, this gives more credence to haplogroup E being the Y DNA chromosome of early Semitic populations if early Semites are descending from PPNB populations. A study on population genomics of Anatolia, the Caucasus, and the Levant found in Arselentep one individual who lived circa 3,369 through 3,110 BC who belonged to E-M84. A study on population genomics of Bronze Age Eurasia found in remains from Nerek Get Shan in Armenia lived during the Middle Bronze Age to E-M84. A study on population genomics of Anatolia, the Caucasus, and the Levant found in the ancient city of Ebla, which is a Semitic city, during the Bronze Age, one male individual who is E-M84. A study on South Asian history, Nar Shimhan et al. 2019, found several individuals belonging to E-Y31991 in late Bronze Age / early Iron Age samples at Swat Valley, modern northern Pakistan. So what's interesting and what we see basically is that some of the oldest and earliest haplogroup E subclades in the Levant, and as you begin to expand from the Levant into Mesopotamia, we begin to see that the haplogroup E clades become younger and that it's seemingly associated with the spread of Semites out of the Levant into Mesopotamia. So here you can see on your screen is a lot of old clades of haplogroup E and some younger clades in the Bronze Age of haplogroup E, but a lot of these older clades are expanding outward into Mesopotamia and they get younger. And this fits exactly with the spread of Semitic people from the Levant into Mesopotamia. So haplogroup E and Semites seem to match perfectly. Again, We estimate that Semitic had an early Bronze Age origin in the Levant, followed by an expansion of Akkadian into Mesopotamia. Again, Semites migrating from the Levant into Mesopotamia. E-M34 is the main Middle Eastern variety of E1B1B and is thought to have arrived with Proto-Semitic people in the late Copper to early Bronze Age. Again, this is all around the same time. Proto-Semitic, haplogroup E, expanding and originating around the same time together. So you see a perfect parallel, a dualism between E and Semites. The most plausible candidates for Semitic remigration to the Fertile Crescent with TMRCAs fitting the arrival of the Akkadians and other early Semitic peoples are certain subclades of both E-V22 and E-V12 with relatively early TMRCAs present in the Middle East could be candidates for such remigration, such as E-F GC14382, TMRCAs 2200 BCE, and E-V3262, TMRCAs 2600 BCE. Again, all around the same time. How Akkadians and early Semites migrating, fitting with the migration of E, because it's likely that early Semites were those E markers migrating. According to the theory, Afro-Asiatic languages spread to Asia via E1b haplogroup, not J1 haplogroup. It is historically known that a ruling elite class of Afro-Asiatic people, Akkadians, Assyrians, etc., also invaded the north of Mesopotamia and brought their Afro-Asiatic languages into the central and northern parts of Mesopotamia during the period of the Akkadians and Babylonians. Elite dominance model of E1B1 might be supposed for Akkadians, Assyrians, and Babylonians. In this sense, it might be theorized that Sumerian was the main language of ancient Mesopotamians before Afro-Asiatic E1B overwhelmed Mesopotamia, elite dominance model. And so again, just to show you, E markers, which would be your Semites, spreading into Mesopotamia, and this would be the Semitic migration. Semites carrying E markers. Fits perfectly. So we find haplogroup E in the Middle Bronze Age Armenia as well. I want to make a point of that. Some people believe that it actually could have been the Akkadian expansion that brought those E markers into Armenia. And even to this day, you even find Armenians and, of course, other Middle Eastern populations that have haplogroup E. As E-M34 was found in Bronze Age Armenian samples, it is possible that Semitic or Afro-Asiatic languages were spoken in Armenia / the Caucasus at some point. That's actually a very important point. So far, we have two E-M84 samples from Narkin Getshan in Armenia, which date back to the Middle Bronze Age. Given the age of these samples, it's possible these individuals' paternal ancestors hailed from neighboring Mesopotamia and arrived in the region with Assyrian traders, who in turn were descendant from the Akkadians. This might hold true for at least one of the two samples. So here are those two samples we found in Bronze Age Armenia, E-L70788 and E-Y5413. And we found them roughly around the same time as well. And so they could have traveled there via the Akkadians. And so here, when it comes to modern samples in the Middle East, here are a lot of Armenian people today who have haplogroup E. And they specifically have this E clade FGC18401. And this was found in Mesopotamia in 4600 YBP. That's years before present. So that would basically be around the time of the Bronze Age. So here's that E sample, dead in Mesopotamia 4,600 years ago, Bronze Age. And of course, you see a lot of Armenian people with this E sample. And here's the Akkadian Empire. It was a very large empire stretching from modern day Iraq to Syria. And like I said, you could have had Semitic people go into the Caucasus, go into Armenia. But of course, Semites never came from the Caucasus into Mesopotamia. Semites were coming from the Levant into Mesopotamia. And as you can see right here, even Semitic peoples are in Arabia and close to the Mediterranean. And pretty much Semites didn't really go above the Euphrates and Tigris River because, as y'all see, you have Gutians right here in the Zagros Mountains. You have the Lubi, and you have Hurrians, and you have the Mitanni. Basically, non-Semitic people were above the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, whereas below the Euphrates and Tigris rivers were Semites, all down here. But again, I just want to show you that you have a lot of modern Middle Eastern peoples with E markers. You have people such as Assyrians, even with these E markers as well. So one of the earliest Semitic civilizations in both the Levant and Mesopotamia was Ebla. It's a very important civilization. And Ebla is an East Semitic-speaking kingdom. East Semitic is similar to Akkadian. One of the oldest Y DNA chromosomes found in Ebla was haplogroup E. Ebla reigned from 3000 to 2300 BC, and haplogroup E was found in Ebla in 2700 through 2500 BC. So here's the kingdom of Ebla. It's in modern-day Syria, basically. And here is the capital of Ebla. And Ebla, first kingdom, from 3000 BC through 2300 BC, as I just said. Establishment was 3000 BC. Disestablishment is 2300 BC. Bronze Age era. And this is the site that we're focusing on. Ebla was one of the earliest kingdoms in Syria. Ebla was an important center throughout the 3rd millennium BC and in the first half of the 2nd millennium BC. Its discovery proved the Levant was a center of ancient centralized civilization equal to Egypt and Mesopotamia, and ruled out the view that the latter two were the only important centers in the Near East during the early Bronze Age. The Levant was always a very important location since ancient times. So, the first Ebelite kingdom has been described as the first recorded world power. According to ancient DNA analysis conducted by, and forgive me for my pronunciation, Sekortanotti et al. 2020, on 10 human remains from Tel Marduk, the individuals of the kingdom of Ebla were a mixture of Levantines, Iranians, and Anatolians. One early Bronze Age individual carried haplogroup E1b1b, a lineage closely linked to the diffusion of Afro-Asiatic languages. Now that's very interesting. So we found an E1b1b individual in the early Bronze Age from 2700 through 2500 BC. And of course, E1b1b, haplogroup E, is part of the diffusion of Afro-Asiatic languages, so this is likely a Semitic person we found. But also we found some other haplogroups, such as, let's finish what the reading says, while 4 Middle Bronze Age individuals carried haplogroups G, J1, and T, and Middle Bronze Age was from 2000 through 18,000 BC. So that's a little bit later. But the oldest one we found is haplogroup E, which is connected to Afro-Asiatic languages. So here is that E sample we found in Syria. It's E-L795, again, early Bronze Age of Ebla, E-L795. So all evidence points to the Natufians, PPNB, Harifian cultures as being the ancestors of Semites. The origins of pastoralism/agriculture comes from Neolithic Levantines. Pastoralism is an important element in early Semitic culture. Furthermore, Semites originate in the Levant, which is the homeland of Natufians. Also, if Semitic populations descend from Neolithic Levantines, then they would have haplogroup E. We see the migration of haplogroup E into Mesopotamia, which fits the same migration patterns of Semites into Mesopotamia, basically from the Levant into Mesopotamia. Furthermore, haplogroup E is found in both Natufians and modern-day Middle Easterners. Check out FamilyTreeDNA.com, titled Natufians DNA Y-DNA Classic Chart. So what will this show you? For genealogy within the most recent 15 generations, STR markers help define paternal lineages. Y-DNA STR markers change, mutate, often enough that most men who share the same STR results also share a recent paternal lineage. This page displays Y chromosome DNA, Y-DNA STR results for the project. It uses the classic format. The columns display each project member's kit number, paternal ancestry information according to project settings, the paternal tree branch haplogroup, and actual STR marker results. So here's the interesting thing that has been found on FamilyTreeDNA.com. Basically, a lot of Middle Easterners have haplogroup E markers that link back to the Natufians, and this is in all parts of the Middle East. Y'all can just go to the website yourselves to see. I don't know if you can see this. It's a bit small, but if you go to the website, you can see a very long list of various Middle Eastern men that have E markers. Because I only took a few screenshots. I could take more. I did take more, but I didn't want to make this too long. So check out the actual website, but here's just an example. In Palestine, in the Palestinian territory, in Iraq, Armenia, Kuwait, Iraq, Palestine territory, Lebanon, a lot of E markers. So I'm just going to name the territories where we found a lot of these E markers. So Iraq and Palestine territory, Jordan, Yemen, Lebanon, Syrian, Arabic Republic, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait and Yemen, and United Arab Emirates, etc. This is where we found a lot of these E markers that are attached to the Natufians. United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, Kuwait, Iraq, and Kuwait, Iraq, and Yemen. Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Oman, Yemen. A lot of E markers. And I'm just going to, basically, it's a lot of the same countries. So I'm just going to go on to the next slide. A lot of Yemen and Iraq and Syria and Palestine and Saudi Arabia. That's basically what you're going to find. And Jordan. And again, a lot of Lebanon as well. Lebanon and Iraq and Yemen and such. Oman and Saudi Arabia. A lot of E markers are in the Middle East. A lot of modern day Middle Easterners have haplogroup E. So here is from the Genomic History of the Middle East, another paper that also displays the various E markers we find in the Middle East. A lot of Yemen and Syrians and Saudi Arabians and United Arab Emirates and Bedouins in Israel, Negev, and Arab Christians in Israel, and Arab Christians, Bedouin Negev, Iraqi people, a lot of Bedouins, Palestinian, Israelis, and Yemens and United Arab Emirates, and etc., etc. A lot of Middle Easterners with haplogroup E that connect back to the Natufians. Best evidence points to the Natufians and related populations as being the ancestors of Proto-Semites. Haplogroup E would be the paternal lineage of early Semitic populations that descend from Natufians. From Natufians to Harifians to PPNB to the Proto-Semites. The last thing I will touch on is the genome of early Afro-Asiatic populations. And the genome of early Afro-Asiatic populations would be Natufian Ancestors because they fit all the criteria. as being Proto-Afro-Asiatic speakers, a Levantine population, specifically from the PPNB period, where you had your first pastoralist and your first agriculturalist. So let's look at the modern distribution of Natufian ancestry. We're going to use a site from Quora titled Whose Ancestry Became Most Widespread Over the Millennia Up to Modern Times, that of Neolithic farming people from Anatolia, Levant, Iran, or the Caucasus. Using a genetic ancestry model with about 20 key reference ancient populations from all over the world, I modeled a large sample of more than 400 modern population groups, generally ethnic groups, regional populations, or entire nationalities that I have access to via the public Global 25 data sheet. And that's what is used for the map that you're about to see, the Global 25 data sheet. After that, I created maps, see below, with the following legend. Darkest tone plus 30%, medium tone between 10% and 30%, lightest tone between 5% and 10%. The earliest farmers of the Levant, who were the culmination of the sedentary and complex hunter-gatherer culture of the Natufians, spread mostly southward and southwestward into Africa, and were apparently encroached in their own homeland by Anatolia, Iran, and Caucasian farmers as they expanded, though it preserves high percentages in the southern Levant, Palestine, Israel, and Jordan. Thus, the genetic ancestry derived from or closely related to the Natufians from the Levant is less widespread in the Old World than the Anatolian one. But its geographic expanse is also very remarkable, particularly in Africa. So as you can see down below, that is actually the map that we are using for Natufian ancestry. And I'm going to blow it up. So as you can see, the highest amount of Natufian ancestry is in the Middle East and also regions close to the Middle East, such as North Africa and East Africa. But the highest concentration of Natufian ancestry is in the Middle East. So we're also going to look at this thread from Anthrogenica titled In Monte with Ancient DNA of the Middle East and Europe from page 2, where there's a map made of the distribution of Natufian ancestry. So this is Levantine Neolithic, and just like from the other image, we see that the highest form of Natufian ancestry is in the Middle East, which makes sense. The Natufians are a Middle Eastern people, an ancient Middle Eastern people. We also see it in Northern Africa, and we see it in the Mediterranean. And what's also interesting about this map is that, and much like the other map, Natufian ancestry it seems that its highest formation stops near Syria and Iraq, and it doesn't go too high into Anatolia and Iran. I'm going to go back to the other map to show you. As you can see, Natufian ancestry, dark shade is in Syria and Iraq, and then it gets lighter once you get into Anatolia and Iran and the Caucasus. Same thing over here. The shade pretty much stops in Syria and Iraq, and then you see basically no shade or very little in Anatolia and Iran and the Caucasus. The reason why this is interesting is because when you look at the language map for ancient Semitic languages and modern Semitic languages, we see that Semitic people and language basically stops in Syria and Iraq, much like how Natufian ancestry stops in Syria and Iraq. And by the way, this is just further evidence that Semites don't come from the Caucasus into the Middle East, because there should be a lot of Semitic speakers here, but really you don't have Semitic speakers in Anatolia and Iran and the Caucasus. This is really where Semites sort of, in a sense, stop expanding. They pretty much only stay in Syria and Iraq, and this is pretty much what you see with Levantine Natufian ancestry. Stops in Syria and Iraq. This is from Cambridge. Given the modern distribution of Semitic languages over the area in question, which belong to the larger Afro-Asiatic family, it seems appropriate to suggest that these first farmers of the Levant and their Mesolithic predecessors, including the Natufian culture, were speaking a Proto-Afro-Asiatic language. It may be that Proto-Semitic continued to develop within the Levant and Syria area, since both Epipalite and Akkadian, early Semitic languages, are there attested early, the former around 2400 BC. So again, this source brings everything together. The Natufian culture connected to Proto-Afro-Asiatic speakers, and Proto-Semitic being in the Levant and Syria, where you see this high concentration of Neolithic Levantine ancestry. This is why it makes sense that Proto-Semitic populations and Afro-Asiatic populations are best represented by this Levant Neolithic DNA, or this Natufian ancestry. It fits perfectly. And it even fits with the Y DNA of haplogroup E. This is from Y chromosome E haplogroups, their distribution and implication to the origin of Afro-Asiatic languages and pastoralism. The Proto-Afro-Asiatic group carrying the E-P2 mutation may have appeared at this point in time and subsequently gave rise to the different major population groups, including current speakers of the Afro-Asiatic languages and pastoralist populations, which of course early Semitic populations were pastoralist and of course Afro-Asiatic speaking. It's likely that they would have carried haplogroup E. And when we look at the distribution of Afro-Asiatic people and languages, we see a perfect overlap with haplogroup E, and also we see a perfect overlap with Natufian ancestry. Of course, the Natufian culture, it was a Epipaleolithic culture that existed from 12,500 to 9,500 BC in the Levant. The Natufian culture is the name given to the sedentary late Epipaleolithic hunter-gatherers living in the Levant region of the Near East between about 12,500 and 10,200 years ago. The Natufians foraged for food such as emmer, wheat, barley, and almonds, and hunted gazelle, deer, cattle, horses, and wild boar. The direct descendants of the Natufian, known as the Pre-Pottery Neolithic or PPN, were among the first farmers on the planet. And of course, from those farmers and agriculturalists would come the Proto-Semites and other Afro-Asiatic populations. And we see a perfect overlap with haplogroup E, like I said, with Levant's Natufian DNA. And also, we see that most populations that have Levant Neolithic DNA are Afro-Asiatic populations. From the Yemenites to the Bedouins to the Saudis to Yemenite Jews to Berbers, Libyans, and Tunisians, and Moroccans, and Palestinians, Jordanians, Samaritans, Tunisian Jews, Moabites, Algerians, and etc. And also these populations typically have high forms of haplogroup E, like Arabs, who actually have about 68%, Berbers, 88%, Sahrawi, 78%, and the list goes on. So I believe that Levant Natufian ancestry corresponds perfectly with Afro-Asiatic and Proto-Semitic ancestry. Therefore, the early Proto-Semitic people would have had Y chromosome haplogroup E and PPNB, Levantine, or Natufian or Neolithic Levantine ancestry. It fits perfectly. Again, the last map I'll show you, the distribution of Natufian ancestry. Highest form of Natufian DNA is seen in the Middle East, and it expands outwards. I guess in a way you can say that Natufian DNA represents Shem. But this is where we end the video. From Natufians to Proto-Semites. If you enjoyed the video, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And don't forget to click the bell, leave any comments or any questions you might have, and follow my social media platforms for any information that you might be looking into. And with all of that out of the way, have a great day and shalom.